Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming out in this miserable evening. I will try and make it worth your while. So my aims this evening are to help you to listen and interpret your own local voices of the past, to discover their original intended meaning, and of course to know the people who coined them. I also hope that you will be surprised, maybe even amazed by some of those names, and I hope I can induce you to do exactly what I did when I discovered, first researched the names around our beautiful Hungary, and that is to look at the settlements and the landscape around with a kind of different eyes, because you understand that people with different cultures, speaking different languages, once called the place that you call home, they called home. And place names were formed many thousands of years ago, not just hundreds but thousands, so we do go into deep history as a result. Now, place names are formed in the image of their creators, I found. So it's about people and their identity and their lives and their observations of what's around them, the natural history and the landscape. John Steinbeck in East of Eden that I wrote, that I read during the lockdown, put it far more succinctly than myself. He said, place names carry a charge of the people who created them. You've just got to interpret them and figure out what they're saying. They're highly descriptive, they're rich in meaning and colloquialisms, and indeed as a collective study, they'll tell you almost everything you need to know about the folks who came before. So their language, their culture, their religion, their distribution and movements, how they lived and worked, even their hobbies, and they still call out across the landscape awaiting interpretation. And that's why in my book, it was fairly easy to categorize place names into personal names, into names related to farming, names related to religion, names related to natural history. That's a snapshot of natural history many hundreds and thousands of years ago are retained in the names. And the book has done pretty well, far better than I had expected. But the fact that the place names are so rich, it means that you can grab an ordnance survey map of Worcestershire, you can grab one of my books, I've got a few for sale this evening, and all the footpaths, and you can stand on the hill of the Saxons, and near the palace of the Hewicki kingdom, the farmstead by the water meadow where the cranes live, or the ridge of Puck, the Hopper. And those are all within a few miles here. And because of these names, you can get to know the folk and what they were doing at the time, and even what they believed in. So these are the people who influenced the names in Britain over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. I apologise for their male gender, I apologise, they're all in military robe, but that's what you get on the internet. You get the Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, our friends the Vikings, and the high status Normans. Now, was anybody born in around here in Chaddesley Corbett? Nobody was born. Sometimes when I ask that question, there's somebody who says yes, and then I ask the next question, what were your relatives included in the 1801 census? Because if they were, it's highly likely, it's more likely than as a probability, this ancestry and genetic ancestry, but it's more likely that you had ancestors amongst these Celts, the local Celts, the Derivation tribe, and the local Anglo-Saxons, the Hewicki tribe, and I'll introduce you to those fairly shortly. Now, what I'd like to do first, two things. I'd like you to hear a few examples of the power of place names in exploring history in general. And I'd like to introduce you to some of the people who I just mentioned who coined these names locally. You will know this slide, I'm sure you will, because these are the Anglo-Saxon, the Germanic peoples, tribes' migrations into southern Britain around about the middle of the 5th century in numbers. And they are responsible for the great Anglo-Saxon place naming period, where they named the places as they expanded between the 5th and 10th century. So most of these names became Anglo-Saxon, more than 90%. What we know is that what place names tell us or remind us is that this was a heathen society moving into a Christian society. The Celts had Christian conversion about the 4th century, and it had to wait till the 7th century for the Anglo-Saxons. And that's why, because there was a kind of a standoff along this line here between the incoming Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic tribes, and the Celts, of the names in southeast England are actually of pagan origin, to do with the god Woden and his son Thuno and various pagan activities. And there's a concentration that even after 1500 years will echo that paganism. Now, this slide you also become aware of, I think, have been aware of in the past, and this is the kind of Little England beyond Wales. But what it is, it's a language and place name divide. And this is a physical division between Norman and English castles and Celtic castles. So the more fertile land in the south were under the power of the Norman England, and the north the Celts. What's really interesting to me is that recent genetic population studies have shown that it is here that there's the preponderance of the genetic markers, the genetic signatures of Anglo-Saxons. So in place names, as well as in our genes, the past is clearly written in the present. It's just a matter of interpretation and looking into it. My last slide in relation to the power of place names. As the Anglo-Saxons were migrating into the country, there was a fairly mass migration of the Celts into other areas of northwest Europe. So they set up kingdoms in the Jersey Isles. This here became Brittany. Brittany is in fact Little Britain, is the meaning that the Celts gave to it. And even little populations in Galicia of Celts. There was a Celtic Christian church founded there in the 7th century in Britannia. The name is Britannia, a Celtic name. Now, I'm taking you back here now, about 1,000 years BC. You wouldn't believe that, but it's true, that this is a language map, and this part of southern Britain started to become red, if you like, with a Celtic tongue, and it's a common Brythonic Celtic tongue. And you say, why are you telling me this? 1,000 years. Around here, probably around about 600 years BC, it's because it was a common Brythonic Celtic language, and because that evolved, diverged into Cumbric Celt, into Celtic Welsh, into Cornish Welsh, and Cornic Celt, and into Breton. And it's hard to believe, but these still echo, these names still echo even after 2,500 years, and they echo very much so in the enduring features of the landscape. The Anglo-Saxons, when they came in, made notes, their scribes made notes, listened to the Celtic language, and placed these place names into their language, into their references. This is the Davini tribe. We're getting now towards Worcestershire. The Davini tribe cover a large area: Worcestershire, West Warwickshire, parts of Somerset, parts of Gloucestershire, and Herefordshire. And the Davini tribe, there are 7 references in their Roman manuscripts. They were a well-organized tribe. They they were one of the few Celtic tribes which minted their own coins. Some of the coins were found in my neck of the woods in around my church. And there was a treaty, a very early treaty with the Romans, so this area here became a Roman excivitus, and the war effort went west towards the Silures. You might be interested to hear all these names mean something, and the Celts used superlative, bombastic terms. So this was the victorious ones. The Catabalini were the battle-hardened ones. And the Aconites were the Catabalini were the victorious ones too, and there's another one. The Acolytes were the hard ones. In those days, you wouldn't want to call yourself those who get slightly faint at the sight of blood tribe, because they could So I'm now taking you to some of the features of the landscape around Worcestershire, some around here I can tell you about, that echo that Celtic language, pre-Roman Celtic language, common Brythonic Celtic language. So this is our beautiful hills. When the Dubini tribe came to these parts, they looked up and they called them Moel Ffrin. And the reason they called them Moel Ffrin was that in those days, rather than today, 12% of our county, 12% of England is covered with woodland, then it was 50%. And these hills would have risen above those great forests. And they called them Moel Ffrin, which is bare hills. Moel is a common term used even in modern Welsh. So you can see here not just a description of the physical topography of Worcestershire, but the kind of mental topography of the Celts. They valued that. It's something that they thought, wow, those are their hills. The same is true of, and here, this is Moel Ffrin, that's how it's spelled. It's a soft mutation of the feminine singular noun of Ffrin, which is, the Celtic languages do that, I'm afraid. But bare hill. And that's the earliest written evidence that it has Celtic origins, and that's very, very late in Anglo-Saxon charters. Others have probably been destroyed. Breedon is really interesting because it tells you how things are named. When the Celts came here 600 years BC, they named this Bryn, and we know that from deduction. And then about over a thousand years later, the Anglo-Saxons came, and they borrowed the Bree and called it Dun, which is their name for hill. And of course we, starting in Middle English and in Modern English, call it a hill. So now it shouts across the Severn Valley, but literally hill, hill, hill. Because none of those cultures really understood what the other, they just added to it. And the same is true of many of the rivers. About 70% of the rivers are certainly of England, and many in Worcestershire have a Celtic origin. And also, for example, the Wye Forest is the winding forest, that's Celtic. And even the Forest of Arden is bare and it's oak. Quintessential English is from the Celtic, common Brythonic Celtic, Ardu, meaning high, cognate with the Ardennes, which is also of Celtic origin. And it makes you think why the Anglo-Saxons coming in, migrating in, actually borrowed and brought those strange sounding names into their culture. Was it convenience? Perhaps. Was it respect? Perhaps. Was it because they were different or romantic? But that's what they did. So this is a beautiful team. Again, the team, like so many river names, is actually of Celtic origin. These are all the names I found. These are the modern names. These are the Celtic word for them, the Celtic origin, and these are even the meanings. So we have you have a brook here called Hockney Brook, I believe, and that goes into Elmley Brook. But Elmley is a fairly recent name of the last 1,000 years. Before that, it was called a Doof, and it is the same etymology as Dover. Doof. Dover is called Dover. And Doverdale, it's called Doverdale because the Saxon scribes interpreted it as Dofer, D-O-F-E-R, when the Celtic term for it was Duf, D-W-F-R, cognate with the modern do in modern world. So this is a really important slide because it shows that when the Dubini tribe came, they were pagans themselves. They were animistic ideology. They venerated the natural world and particularly rivers and streams. And they would name, as we saw in the last slide, so many little streams with a definite name. Now, this shows about 2,500 years of history, right up until modern times. The Dubini, this is the tribal area of the Dubini, and then the Hewiki in 577 AD. There was a battle outside Bath in Durham, and the West Saxons defeated the Dubini and their allies. So they were able to move in, and these were the first Anglo-Saxons to move into Worcestershire. So people who you are more likely to be related to if you came from Worcestershire, and particularly if you had family members in Worcestershire in the 1801 census. So the Hewiki migrated in, so many of the place names now in Worcestershire are named by the Hewiki tribe. I mentioned that this is also the Roman civitas in between the Celts and the Hewikis coming in. So the first diocese of Worcester was created in 679. During that 7th century, the Hewiki were undergoing conversion. And this boundary here lasted until about 1035. We missed that recently. And these are the place names in modern Worcestershire related to that Hewiki tribe that came in around here in the middle of the 6th century. And it does tell a story in itself. It means that the Hewiki would have owned the Droitwich salt. A lot of Worcestershire capacity to do with salt, and they would have taken these salt carts they exported them to the west, Richard Ford, the ford of the Hewiki, and Wychwood in Warwickshire, the ford of the Hewiki, and they would bring back from this Wychwood, that is now it's called Wychwood, it's a very small diminished wood, an SSSI actually, in West West Oxford, and they would have brought back wood to burn the brine to get the salt. Okay, now I'd like to give you a challenge, and I'd like to ask you, what is the language being spoken here, and where is what culture, and is represented by this person, and what are they reading? Sorry, I apologise for that, I don't know what. So, at least I can ask you, you're not going to be listening to this gentleman this evening, I don't think, but it's the Lord's Prayer, and it is actually in a Wessex dialect, which is the dialect of the Hewiki, because they came from the south, they came probably from the Thames Valley, which was under the control of Wessex. So that means that several of the place names in Worcestershire, you could tell immediately they are actually from Wessex derivation. Yeah, sorry about that. You really can't. So here are some of the names I've researched. And, oh yes, you know that very well, I think. See if the coat is on. So, Chaddesley Corbett. Chaddesley Corbett, really, really interesting because it tells you so many things. It tells you about the essence of Chaddesley Corbett. It's really shouting out. Some interpretations are very difficult. This is very, very easy. So it tells you it's high status, it tells you it's multicultural, definitely, and it tells you even where it is on the label. We'll start with the Lee. The Lee comes from the Wiki dialect, the Old English, the Anglo-Saxon in their language in Old English, and it comes from the L-E-A-H, Lee. And Lee is a woodland clearing. And those woodland clearings, some of them they would have cleared themselves, some of them would be natural woodland clearings, some of them would have been cleared by the Celts and even the Bronze Age people. And the Chad is interesting because this is a name that the Anglo-Saxon scribes would have used, and it came from a Celtic personal name, from Chiada, that would be pronounced, it's always a hard C, and Chiada. And so it is the woodland clearing of a man called Chiada, and of course Corbett. Yeah, you know what Corbett? Do you know what Corbett means in Old French? It means a raven. And so this is a high status Norman family. And so absolutely a fascinating etymology. So I think we're standing in Rockcote now. Is it that part of Chaddesley Corbett? And if you look really right back, Rockham Cot, so the cottage by the brook, it's pretty straightforward. And again, that's with the Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Saxon words within that place name. Swancote, nothing to do with swans. In Middle English, swain, meaning a swineherd, and therefore the herdsman's cottage. And it later, in Middle English, became a word for a company. Again, very late in Anglo-Saxon charters. The Anglo-Saxons started writing down the names of places and who owned them, etc., in about 670 AD. Harvington is interesting because in the vast majority of places, this would be Tom, this would be ing, as in Birmingham. Ing denotes the family of or followers of, and it's usually a man called Hare or Har, or, because of mutation over the years, because of what's called corruption, it goes to Harvington. It's easy to say, but it's nothing like that. In 1275, we have Herwin Tom. Herwin is a female name, so it's one of those very rare females, Anglo-Saxon female, who owned land here. Randan Wood. Have you had any thoughts about Randan Wood and where it derives? Because it's really unusual. From what I've seen and what I've heard, the expert etymologists and toponymists that say that it is Celtic origin and later became Rise of the Chase. I don't know, I feel a bit uncomfortable with that.
I was told, I read somewhere that they had to get rid of wolves, and it was the noise they made with their sticks and shouting.
So it is the noise of hunting.
Something like that.
Yes, I'll tell you about wolves a little later. Cat Percy coppice. Are you aware of Cat Percy coppice? I spent but what's really interesting about here, it's a hamlet from a hamlet that we know existed, Catsforgy, but it disappeared. It was abandoned in, I think, the 14th century. Any idea why that should be? Yes, the Great Death. Black Death. And that's interesting. You know this area better than I. I is a loan word into the English language from Old Scandinavian, and it refers to not an island in the sea, but a firmish ground which is surrounded by marshy ground. There are lots of words. About 60% of words in the English language are actually loan words. That's why the English language is so vibrant. Another one is very few around here, but in Danelaw, it's about 30 to 40 miles east of us, you get lots of byes. And bye is a kind of old Scandinavian name for a locality or a homestead, farmstead, and we use it now in bylaws and byways, local laws, local way. That is called stains. The stone or stone in Old English, probably a boundary marker. And some people have said a site of religious rite, but I don't know. I haven't got any further evidence to suggest that. Tan wood. Any idea about tan wood? The game's given away by that 1290 twen wood, between wood. You get lots of twinings in England, and twinings are settlements between two rivers. Very good defensive position. There's quite a number of twinings in England. But it's the homestead between the two woods. Belbroughton is really interesting because in early manuscripts, it's definitely two different settlements. So there's the Beyond and the Belem the Beyond and the Brockton in 817, and then that became in 1086. This is the Doomsday Survey, Belem and Brockton. And it's only in 1292 it became Belbroughton and therefore Belbroughton. The Belem is the old name for the local brook, and I believe that comes from the Old English word henbane. Have you come across henbane? No. It's a plant, it's a water-loving plant, and it's highly toxic. So we do see sometimes in casualty people who have mistaken it for other things. And so it's the farmstead or homestead by Belem Brook, named after the henbane. He also got the Brune family held the manor in the 13th century, and the manor then was referred to Brian's Bell. I don't think that's related to anything earlier in the etymology. There's a breech farm. There's breech farms in Belbroughton, I understand, Haddington and Stolton, and this comes from the Middle English birch, which is recently reclaimed or cultivated land, very often found near ancient forests and waste ancient forests, certainly around here. And the same too is riding. We have some ridings in the Hanbury field names and locality names, and this again is the clearing of asset land taken from the into the estate. I thought I'd mention Feckenham Forest. Feckenham Forest comes from the Feckenham. Now you're really getting interesting. This is 804, about 200 years after Hewicki moved into this region. The farmstead homestead by a water meadow of a man called Fecker, and we have Feckenham and we have Fecker's Voodoo, so the Feckenham Woods. What's, I think, really interesting, this is the marker that you know you're entering the forest, but more precisely, you know you're entering forest law, because the penalties for doing things naughty and stealing things in our royal forest were very severe. And this was the entrance to the forest by Hanbury School. But that was before 1301. After 1301, the forest was extended way above Chaddesley to Stone and Belbroughton. And we know a lot about this forest. It was a royal hunting forest, Edward the Confessor in pre-Norman times, and he started hunting in it. And you can tell that it's got a woodland past because the Lee, the woodland clearing, the settlement in the woodland clearing, Bent Lee, that's the woodland clearing of bent grass which goes horizontally and then suddenly up coarse grass. And Bradley is broadly a very, very large woodland clearing. So it gives you an impression of that there were great woodlands here. At the time, Thackeray was where the jail and the law courts were, the gallows were just outside Hanbury here, and there were very heavy fines. The animals that were hunted in this forest were hare, red and fallow deer, and martins, otters, wild boar, wild cats, and wolves. I came across a charter of 1167 which records the sheriff paid 3 shillings for a hunter for destroying the woods, for the wolves infecting the forest. But who was very good at that was one of your own sons called Peter Corbett. And Peter Corbett was appointed by Henry III to rid about 4 counties around here, Gloucestershire, Staffordshire, Herefordshire, of wolves. And Peter said he would do it, and he'd throw in wildcats too. So he was trying to exterminate the wolves and the wildcats in order primarily because of the lucrative wool trade. They didn't want wolves around. But in fact, he didn't totally succeed, because the last wolves were wildcats were here in Worcestershire till about the 17th and 18th century. And there are names called Wolves Trap and Wolves Lair in Worcestershire, place names. Okay, so I'd like to move on now. We're going to come back to local place names. I have got a table of the interpretation of local place names. I'll tell you a little bit now about Worcestershire in general. And this is a sample of the place names of Worcestershire related to personal Anglo-Saxon names and their meaning. There's about 400 that I guess of place names in Worcestershire which are related to Anglo-Saxon personal names. And 1 or 2 royalty too. King Penda there's about 3 names after King Penda, the old Mercian warhorse. Now this caught my eye. What am I doing showing you a slide? I'm walking through Worcestershire, walking through Worcester, and there's a new building site, a new housing estate. Well, it's this here, Wheelgora. I was talking to somebody earlier about retaining the meaning of words. This is highly significant. The Wheelgorans, they were the first Anglo-Saxon tribe to come into that particular settlement. We know there was a settlement before Caergaragon, and that was Celtic, next to a Roman fort. And then in 717, for example, like this 691 was only about 100 years after the Hewicki moved into Worcestershire. The Wheelgorna the Cester, like Cheshire and Dorchester and Winchester, it denotes a settlement on a previous Roman fort. So Wheelgorna, people of the winding river. The first Anglo-Saxon charters show these Wheelgorna in the wild forest. And it's strange, but the Hewicki name is of, although they're an Anglo-Saxon tribe, is of Celtic origin, and so too this may well be. But we know when the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts were fighting and trying to kill each other, they were marrying and cooperating together. And many Anglo-Saxon kings used to name their sons and daughters, princes and princesses, after Celtic names. So the high-status Celts were cooperated with, along with the high-status Anglo-Saxons. So there we are, the people of the winding river. You can't ignore Droitwich because it is a very important place, and therefore its etymology is really, really long. It comes into the Roman literature around about this time. There were several Salinae in England at the time, and then the Anglo-Saxons They state things really kind of point blank. It's a lovely name, Salt Wick. See out Wick. It means that Wick means a settlement which produces something special. So Warwick is probably a dairy farm. It's usually a dairy farm by a warray, which is a weir on the River Aid. But then it was in 1313 it was Witch. Now I presented to Droitwich, and some people believe the word witch is because the king, the French-speaking king, gave the town the right to produce salt. That may or may not be, but I know the expert etymologists believe it comes from this dairy witch, and it was foul witch. So basically, a dirty town, a dirty specialist town. It was very good, historical data. The citizens of Droitwich took it with great energy. They didn't get thrown things up. The importance of salt, there were many Sialk way around the county, salt ways. Bromsgrove is Brem's Graf, and this is Brem means illustrious. It's exactly the same etymology as Birmingham. The beginning of Birmingham, the first forms that Birmingham took was Brem ing Ton. Bren in Ham. So Ham, a settlement by water meadow, Ing, the followers of a man called Bren, who was the illustrious. He founded both Birmingham and Bromsgrove and wanted to He fought in the Battle of Hastings, or a Bren fought in the So Finstal, a local part of Bromsgrove, comes from Finstalis, a firewood store in order to heat the brine. So there were 15 cartloads, as one charter says, there's 15 cartloads of wood required to make 1 mite of salt, which is about a handful of salt. There's lots of grafters around, and these are coppice wood specifically to keep those fires burning and making salt. And of course, the salt ford where salt is carried, where those who would have exported their salt. Bewdley is really interesting because it comes on the map first as Gerberhalle and Rubenhalle, from the Old English meaning the hock of land of a man called a driver. And what's really interesting is it's one of the very rare times when the Normans came along and said, we hate that name. They thought the Old English dialect was very vulgar and not very pretty. So they called it Bewdley, Beaulieu, the beautiful place, like the old Bowley in Hampshire, I think, isn't it? So that ribbon hall now corresponds to the east of the river, and Bewdley to the old town on the left bank. So have you ever heard of what do you think Snottingham is? Snottingham? Yeah, it's Nottingham, but it was changed by the Normans. Sorry, yes?
Snott's Village.
Sorry?
Snott's Village is what I heard.
Yes, was the original name. Now, Evesham is really interesting. When the wiki came into Worcestershire, as in general in the country, it's the river valleys were really wanted. So you see that Evesham is important, and it is very, very long etymology, 709. That's very, a few, only 100 years after the wiki moved in. And hom is the word given to, very similar to ham. Ham is a water meadow, but hom is a settlement in a bend of a river. And there are very few places that have got such a bend. I think Shrewsbury has probably got a bigger bend than Evesham. And then equine ham. Equine was one of the first bishops of Evesham, and one of the first abbot, and one of the third bishops of Worcester. And I'm not sure whether you know the story, but he had a herdsman called Eof. And Eof saw the Virgin appear to him, holding a book with two maidens in attendance. This is the story. And about 2 weeks later, Equine, the bishop, saw exactly the same vision. And they took this to be an abbey, not just a church, but an abbey must be built there. And Pope Constantine duly agreed. So it became Equine Ham. But later, the name of the herdsman was taken. So it's Eof Ham, which later became Evesham. The F, there's no V in the Celtic or Anglo-Saxon alphabet. The V is always, like your verb is always a Norman influence. What people didn't figure out was what Cronach Hon, it occurs on quite a number of charters, and I looked into this, and it's now been accepted that, any idea what Cronach Hon is? It's the water, the settlement by the water meadow where the cranes live. And I'm sorry, but we're not going to get any sound out of this, I don't think. Which is a shame, we'll be come back. But these cranes, they're large birds, they have really complex and big courtship dances. They would not be ignored in the marshy areas in England. So much so that there's about 200 place names named after the crane. They all tend to be in wetlands. The ones in the north tend to be called the prefix tran, which is the old Scandinavian dialect for crane. Fladbury is interesting. Bury means, in Old English, it comes from the Old English Anglo-Saxon bucks. They really would have spat it out. So Hanbury, where I come from, is hind and bucks. And this is Fladbury. And it's the fortified settlement of a woman called Flade, the purity or beauty. In Anglo-Saxon times, and Celtic times too, if you were an able woman, a good leader, intelligent, you could see things coming before most of the people, you would get into high status. That was closed down when the Normans came. That they aren't very many. There is some evidence to suggest that in Mercia, the women had more freedom than in the other heptarchy, the other 7 kingdoms of England at the time. Pershore is interesting because the etymology suggests that it is from Persh, which is osiers or willows, and Ora, which is ridge. And this Ora is specifically a Wessex dialect. So we know it was the Hewiki who came into these areas, and they were much sought after because they were fertile plains. Now here I'm standing on one of the hills which are between Worcestershire and Birmingham. And if I was standing there in the beginning of the 8th century, I'd be looking over the kingdom of the Hewiki, and then to my back would be the great power of Mercia. And it was the beginning of the Mercian supremacy, where Penda was doing lots and lots of battles. He was the last pagan king of one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And the reason I'm saying this is that there is a crescent of hills which kind of divide Worcestershire from the Birmingham conurbation. And there they are. They're about 25 miles, because Once Hill is just outside Ulster. And what these imply very heavily, these place names, is there was tension and conflict, which we know in history there was, between the kingdom of the Hewiki and the much larger kingdom of Mercia. So much so, this is the watchtower. So all the prefix of the names you saw mean the watchtower place name. And indeed, after 40 years, the Hewiki kingdom was subdued and taken over by the Mercians. So place names do tell you a lot if you can analyse them. So this is an old map of the Anglo-Saxon hundred. If you remember, 100 is the kind of amount of land which can support 100 people. And it's a kind of division of the shires for administrative, military and judicial purposes. But they often had a meeting place. And the meeting place within the 100 was pretty obvious. It was a large rock or a large tree. There was often a road, a main road very near it. And we know some of them because we can interpret what they mean. And all these here, the closest one is Dodwood, Dodders, Ford. Dodder is now manifest as a surname, Dodkins, isn't it? And that's the derivation of Dodkins, it started in Worcestershire. So the Dodding tree, Dodders tree, really large 100 on the west side of the county. So this is the beautiful Teme Valley. I think we all love the Teme Valley. It's really brimming with place names. It's kind of more west than here, therefore it will have more names of Celtic origin. And for example, Mambo has the same etymology as Manchester, because the old form of Manchester began with Mam, and Mam is a Celtic word meaning breast. And it's a breast-like hill that must be around here. Frith is Celtic for common, Menith is mountain, and what's really interesting is Pensax. Pensax is what the neighbours, the Celtic neighbours, would call their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. Pen meaning head of or hill, and sax is the word that the Anglo-Saxons gave themselves. They call themselves the Seax, and the Seax comes from this characteristic dagger. That's an artifact, and that's a replica. The fascinating thing about this, I find, is that you get some kind of social diversity here. All the names in the Fertile Valley are Anglo-Saxon origin, and this is much higher ground, less fertile. There's also some Lindridge and Linton and there's about 5 names beginning with L-I-N, Lineholt, Linden, and they come from Old English Lindon, the lime tree. And it tells you right on the page that this is a nationally important place for small leaf lime. And that was thousands of years ago they've been there, but it's written on the label if you care to look. In my studies, I have realized that the peoples in the past, particularly the Anglo-Saxons, particularly the Celts, they observed the environment and the natural history and everything around them. I think the average Anglo-Saxon, the average Celt, observed them far more than we do. Why? Because they were really, really dependent on them. And some of these place names will tell us what was happening, what was important to them in the environment, in the natural history at the time. So, any idea what that is? Yeah. Any idea what that might be? The settlement name in Worcestershire might be? So the woodland clearing, this is believed it, the woodland clearing of I'm not. So here I am on the west side of the River Severn, and this is Beverley Weir, this is Beverley Island, and this is the new Salmon and Chad Twait Lock for those migration of those fish. And why am I showing you this? What is the meaning of Beverley? Beverley is very similar to Barnhall, Beaver Bell. And we know that there are about 22 Beverleys, settlements in England which are named after the beaver. So we know that it was in decline in Anglo-Saxon times around 500 to 900 AD. We know that it was going down, and you can make those observations from that. There is a beaver, and I think that is an English beaver. The wonderful thing is that because of reintroductions of wildlife, place names now are living up to what they were called, and the meaning now is what they were called. The meaning comes back, it's a valid meaning. In 1038, otter burn. Burn, as you probably guessed, now is brook. This is otter brook. So this is actually a Worcestershire otter eating an eel or something in one of the lakes in Worcestershire, modern Worcestershire. It's wonderful to think that these things can happen, and place names can be, all place names can be validated. It was mainly the white-tailed fish eagle. So they've been reintroduced to the Isle of Wight in the last few years, and now they're flying over settlements on the south coast which bear their name of the eagle in Any idea where the settlement is here? This is a sparrow, the head sparrow, and that's near one of the reserves, Nap and Paper Mill, the Worcestershire Wildlife Reserve. This caught my eye, laps. Any idea where laps come from?
You did.
Yes. It is beautiful. It's one of these streets in the is it cloth? Right, I see. I see flax. This lane in Bewdley leads down to the river, and here is one of the old fords that cross the River Severn in Bewdley, and it's also a salmon run. So it's named after salmon. What fascinates me, because I'm interested in languages, what fascinates me is there's so many laxes in Indo-European languages, right across Europe, because there's so many salmon in historical times. In Old English is the axe, Middle English lax, German lax, Dutch lax, Swedish lax, and that's why etymologists, experts in language, have extrapolated plaque and found that it comes from a name of locks around about 8,000 years ago, around about the Black Sea. And that's because there, the Indo-European language started, some of that language went down to India, Sanskrit, a written language of 4,000 years ago. And we know that, for example, that a tributary of the Ganges is called the Tamas. The Tamas is totally cognate with routine and with the Tees and the Thames. They all mean, even here, they mean the dark one in language, but of course these would be far, far before any language. I just think that's incredible for this continuity, that place names can make you look deep back into history for many thousands of years. So this comes from a chapter of my book. That's on the hour. Absolutely on the hour. Thank you. Happy. Thank you very much indeed.